Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Tech Talk, Security Lessons from the Field. My name is Sarah Queen, Senior Marketing Manager for our services portfolio here at Citrix. In today's session, our Citrix Consulting Services team will share key security gaps that are routinely identified during field engagements and simple ways to proactively harden and lock down your own Citrix environment. We will then close with the new security offerings available from our consulting team should you need additional support. Before we get into the presentation, let me quickly review a few housekeeping details. We will have a live Q&A session toward the end of today's event, and you're welcome to submit your questions during the presentation. Simply type your question into the Ask a Question window and click Submit. Also, we are recording this event, and the on-demand version will be available from the same link that you used to join today. So feel free to come back, watch the archive, or share it with your colleagues. And finally, the slides are available for download from the Event Resources tab located along the top of the interface. Okay, now I'll go ahead and hand it over to Mike Schaefer, Senior Director of our Enterprise Practice team, to get started. Mike?
Thanks, Sarah. So this is Mike Schaefer. I am the Senior Director of Enterprise Practice. I've been with Citrix Consulting for a little over 15 years. Today, we'll be talking about some common themes within security, some of our top security findings we see in our projects, best practices, and how Citrix can help you uncover and address security concerns within your organization. So let's kick things off with some common security themes. First, we can take a look at how we prioritize risks. On the vertical axis is the likelihood that an incident will occur. The horizontal axis measures the impact an incident will cause. From this, we can see which risks should be the main focus and where we should direct our action. Often, organizations are focused on zero-day attacks, as they tend to get a lot of press when they happen. A zero-day attack is a vulnerability that is unknown to the vendor and is exploited before the vendor can produce a patch or a fix. While certainly ominous, prioritizing this type of attack often takes the focus away from the long-standing risks that are much more likely to occur. While zero-day attacks are low on the likelihood scale, recent attacks such as the WannaCry ransomware and NotPetya malware had extremely high organizational impacts and were preventable simply by using patches that had already been released. Still though, inside threats, especially related to unauthorized transferring of sensitive customer information, are often overlooked. The most likely incidents come from employees within the organization. Data theft is common, and the topics of data exfiltration are commonly not considered. Employing proper data controls, authentication, and ensuring system availability are key topics that require attention and proper planning. Gartner says, through 2020, zero-day vulnerabilities will play a role in less than 0.1% of attacks in general, excluding sensitive government targets. So it's easy to get caught up in the notion of zero-day attacks, but the vast majority of attacks that are successful exploit well-known vulnerabilities. It's important that security teams combat existing vulnerabilities and ensure that basic security is effective. Many times, when we're speaking with our customers, they're actually aware of a significant amount of the security findings we enumerate for them. This might be long-standing items that have had previously been called out by IT or security teams, but just have never been properly addressed. Reasons for this can include no budget, prioritization of other IT or security projects, or no leadership buy-in, etc. Often, it'll take a third party, such as Citrix as the vendor, to reinforce the bottom-up messaging to get management to act in a timely manner and implement a top-down plan. I have one more Gartner quote before I turn the presentation over to Nick. By 2020, IT-sponsored information security programs will suffer 3 times as many significant breaches as those sponsored by business leaders. The point here is that it really takes a top-down sponsorship approach of these efforts to be really effective, which is where our consulting teams have a lot of experience. With that, I'll turn things over to Nick Zabernik, who will go into more detail about our top security findings and best practices.
All right, thanks, Mike. I think that's a great summary of the overarching themes we commonly run into.
So how do those themes match with what our consulting teams are seeing in the field? Well, next I want to go through some of the most common security gaps we see when reviewing our enterprise customer environments. The first category of security findings I'd like to discuss relate to user access mechanisms. This includes authentication and what we call contextual access, or the scenarios and methods by which users access systems. Authentication is consistently one of the biggest attack vectors out there. Verizon even pegged authentication attacks as being responsible for over 80% of all hacking-related breaches in 2017. Yet, we still see many enterprises that have relaxed authentication requirements. This notably includes weak authentication on perimeter networks, including access to external services like Citrix. In addition, those passwords may be poorly protected in transit by weak encryption mechanisms, further putting them at risk. Along with this, many organizations are not applying security controls based on access scenarios, but rather statically through things like Active Directory group membership. This effectively treats users the same in any scenario, whether they are accessing Citrix services from the internal corporate network or remotely at home from, let's say, an old Windows XP desktop. In addition, that home device where users are allowed external access is often not accountable for even basic security standards, even though it potentially has read and write data capabilities once connected. The common theme here is that while there are often administrative controls, such as manager approval to work from home or to receive a remote access token, there are no additional technical controls such as policy and lockdowns for external users inside the network. Now, if we start looking inside the data center, our teams find many gaps related to the user OS and application layers that are being served through Citrix. First, we find the ability to break out or gain access to unintended applications, operating system, or network capabilities is generally trivial and only requires a quick Google search to accomplish. Even basic operating system lockdowns, especially in a shared environment like XenApp, are not in place. This allows users easy access to things like PowerShell, Command Prompt, and other powerful system tools. Another one of the classic lockdowns for remote desktop sessions especially is hiding of local system drives. Users won't be able to see system files if they open up an Explorer window, for example, and may not even be able to browse to them with something like the C drive. However, they are still able to utilize system variables and other UNC paths like localhost to get access to the drive. From there, they will have read and even write permissions. Beyond the operating system, many organizations don't perform any sort of application analysis to determine security risks. This is true for commercial software such as Microsoft Office, but especially true for internally developed applications. Often those applications will never have been reviewed from a security perspective, but might not even have active application owners or SMEs within the enterprise. This alone is a big source of unknown security risk. When looking at data specifically, we often see scenarios where critical business data is unnecessarily put at risk to exfiltration. As Mike stated previously, many customers often treat data exfiltration as a secondary risk to something like hacking security breaches. Often we see, especially in enterprises where there is a bring your own program, that there are minimal technical controls preventing data from residing on those unmanaged devices. So now we have a scenario where a completely unmanaged device, no encryption, maybe no antivirus, perhaps access through a weak password, fingerprint scanner, or something similar, that's storing company data. Remember, users will always err on the side of what's easier rather than what is most secure. If I'm allowed to copy a spreadsheet to my personal laptop, store it in my Google account, and edit it in Google Sheets, well, that's probably what I'm going to do. From a data center perspective, we often find that our customers don't have mechanisms for detecting or preventing data from leaving the enterprise proactively. On the reactive side, we also often find that there is limited auditing available in the case of a data security incident, and audit trails are almost impossible to build. One of the security categories that often gets overlooked is that of system availability. Believe it or not, many Citrix deployments still contain single points of failure that are at risk of causing complete system outages. This not only includes hardware and software components, but also processes that don't account for availability. In many cases, even if there is high availability in the system design through load balancing of components, for example, oftentimes it is not implemented properly to be effective. Looking at broader availability of services during disaster events, we find that many customers have DR procedures for their Citrix environment, but do not perform exercises to test those procedures. Beyond this, we find that many organizations don't have succession plans for their key personnel. Often this means there are one or two Citrix gurus that are generally responsible for many of the engineering and operational duties within the environment. If these people left the company or were otherwise unavailable, operational security of the environment would be severely compromised. On the networking side, we still see use of weak or even publicly compromised certificate cryptography, hashes, ciphers, and SSL protocols. Remember, things like Poodle and Beast attacks are well documented, meaning even unknowledgeable attackers may be able to pull them off with proper tools. Inside the internal network, we also find that many organizations don't have security in place to prevent unmanaged devices from connecting. Many times, if a user has an Ethernet port connection on a BYO device, they would be able to connect it to a corporate network without any restrictions. On the data center side, we see our networking devices being deployed with unused services, ports, and interfaces being enabled. This increases the attack surface of the device and should be locked down appropriately. Another often overlooked part of environment security is operations and maintenance. There are often major gaps in some of the critical environment processes that introduce risk. This includes poor approval processes for environment changes, minimal training of staff, and even if the processes themselves are sound, corners are often cut to save time when following them. This puts the environment at additional risk as human error causes reduction or denial of service for extended periods of time. We also find that monitoring tools are many times only partially implemented and more often than not, relatively ignored because they are not providing pertinent information. On the reactive side, we find that environment auditing data, such as event logs, is non-existent or never reviewed until there actually is a security incident. Even then, there is only minimal forensic data available after an incident for it to be properly assessed. So now that we've taken a look at some of the most common security gaps across our customer set, let's take a look at some of the best practices for mitigating and remediating them. Starting off with authentication. The first recommendation here should come as no surprise to anyone dealing with external access to their environment. If you are operating with untrusted devices, those that are not controlled by your company, connecting to internal resources, single-factor authentication is just not good enough. Multi-factor must be used for these access scenarios to prevent unauthorized data and system access, and is probably the #1 tip to keep your business out of the news. Something you know plus something you have is the industry standard, and any of the common authentication second factors like tokens or smart cards work great for this. For things like radius authentication, we recommend that this factor is placed first as the primary mechanism inside NetScaler rather than LDAP authentication. This prevents attacks with known account names from locking out users, as token authentication must succeed first before NetScaler attempts LDAP authentication. We also need to make sure that limits are set for authentication and access. This includes maximum logon attempts, generally configured as 3, as well as failed login timeouts to prevent brute force attacks against your authentication system. These are both trivial to set up on NetScaler devices performing AAA services. Other timeouts related to authentication, specifically storefront services and NetScaler gateway session timeouts, are important to configure properly for different access scenarios. For example, external users that utilize a single VDI desktop should have these timeouts configured for only several minutes to reduce security risk. Internally, it's still important to protect user credentials and passwords. Secure LDAP should always be used for Active Directory authentication. This holds true for authentication coming from the DMZ, like from a NetScaler gateway, but also any internal services. In addition, Citrix XML services residing on delivery controllers should always be secured with proper certificates using TLS. By default, user passwords coming from storefront to the XML service are only encoded. This means they are not encrypted or hashed, but rather scrambled. This encoding is very easy to break and could result in passwords being compromised by those who have access to the infrastructure or the network. Don't be the one responsible for your CEO's password being stolen by a rogue administrator. Securing this is made extremely easy in XenDesktop 7 by installing a valid internal certificate on each delivery controller that will be used for XML services. Protecting your data means ensuring it is secure both at rest and in transit. The first step in protecting data at rest is ensuring that data cannot reside on unmanaged or insecure devices. This means if laptop devices are not managed by the enterprise and are not being scanned or vetted in any manner, say with NetScaler endpoint analysis scans, the device should not be allowed to potentially store business data. This also applies to mobile devices that are not being controlled by an MDM solution, although the risk is lower. To protect against this, we recommend limiting the Citrix HDX channels to these devices. This includes removing storage, network device, USB, clipboard, and printing redirection unless absolutely necessary. For example, many times clipboard redirection is enabled for these devices, allowing easy data exfiltration or execution of code on internal resources. These items should only be granted by exception for valid use cases and not across the board. In particular, clipboard access can granularly be locked down in a bidirectional manner depending on what type of data is being transferred. For data in transit, we need to ensure that we are using strong methods of encryption protection. This includes both external data as well as internal data, which is often overlooked. From a protocol perspective, SSL 3.0 and TLS 1.0 should always be disabled across the enterprise. I would also recommend that you should look to phase out TLS 1.1 and implement TLS 1.2 only in the future. Only strong cryptographic ciphers should be used. This means no ARC4 stream ciphers or MD5 hashing for certificate signatures. Use strong AES encryption where possible and phase out triple DES in the near future, even though it is still FIPS 142 compliant. I would also recommend organizations start now and looking at using elliptic curve certificates and ciphers, along with Diffie-Hellman key exchange for perfect forward secrecy. Another overlooked tip is to make sure that the order of ciphers is properly set and that any weak ciphers still needed for compatibility are listed at the bottom. Remember, this doesn't only apply to network devices like NetScalers, but also to web services running on Windows, so make sure to review and edit those cipher capabilities. To allow for proper data access tracking and auditing, data loss prevention software should exist on Citrix XenDesktop or XenApp hosts. There are many third-party tools to assist with this and are another part of defense in depth against loss of critical business data. In addition, untrusted devices should not be allowed on corporate networks by utilizing network access controls like port security. Internal client devices for Citrix should have removable media restricted to prevent easy data exfiltration. An important part of security is arming your users and your team with the proper knowledge. Education is critical to ensure end users follow security best practices when utilizing your systems. For example, if users are approved for external use, mandatory system access and security training should be in place as part of administrative controls prior to this type of access being granted. Again, this should not be a suggestion, but a mandatory part of the approval process. Education of the administrative teams is also critical to environment availability and security. Formal vendor training, like Citrix education courses and certifications, should be held by multiple resources within the team. This helps prevent human error due to lack of administrative knowledge. Documentation is also important to create and maintain properly. System and process documentation needs to exist and be easily accessible by the relevant IT teams. Without accurate process documentation, for example, deployment of new provisioning server image versions, environment outages can be caused by simple human error. This is something I've seen on multiple occasions across my own customer set. We also recommend that you arm yourself with the proper knowledge from your software vendors. Many companies, Citrix included, provide subscription services for alerting on security and patch updates. To ensure minimal time to mitigation and remediation, your team should be subscribing to these alerts. Speaking of alerts, proactive monitoring and alerting of the environment is absolutely critical to ensuring availability. Citrix provides tools like Director and NetScaler Management and Analytics, or MAS, to facilitate this. For alerts specifically, take the time to baseline your environment for normal operating conditions and then determine what abnormal conditions look like for alerting. Don't just set an alert for host CPU utilization at 80% if your servers are undersized for the tasks that they are performing. We also recommend auditing the configurations of your systems to determine if there are any deltas from their design configuration state. We often find that during normal operations, teams make changes that affect the security posture of the environment without updating documentation. Manual auditing or using tools like NetScaler MAS to determine any configuration drift should be done periodically in any Citrix environment. One of the biggest tips I can give any Citrix team is to invest the necessary resources and time into security. A major part of implementing and maintaining a good security posture is performing the necessary analysis of your systems and then taking the time to address the findings of that analysis. Make sure that you have proper approvals and checks for any process that relies on human intervention. For example, before deploying a new master VDI image, a secondary resource, someone who is not responsible for the administration and testing of that image, should review and approve that process before the last OK button is hit. Yes, this will increase the time of these processes, but it will also ensure environment availability. Take the time to perform analysis of your application sets before publishing. This includes fully reviewing any vendor documentation for hardening of those applications. For example, there are many resources out there regarding securing Microsoft Office to prevent things like malicious code execution and minimizing dialog box access, thus preventing the potential for users to break out. Internally developed applications should always have an application owner or team who can help perform analysis before publishing externally through Citrix. Baseline lockdowns of operating systems should always be done, and granular lockdowns, such as NTFS permissions, should always be in place. There are Microsoft security baseline settings for specific types of servers that should always be utilized. However, more time should be invested in analyzing and minimizing what users actually have access to. This includes restricting things like Control Panel, Command Prompt, PowerShell, and even things like FTP and Paint should be disallowed unless necessary. Both of these can be used to gain access to other command executables beyond their intended functions. Citrix has common criteria group policy objects for XenDesktop 7 that are publicly accessible, which can provide a decent baseline for restricting access to OS functions within a Citrix environment. Now, these blacklist type lockdowns should be done at a minimum. However, the only way to guarantee program execution security is by utilizing whitelisting. Microsoft provides this natively through AppLocker, but there are also many third-party companies that specialize in this as well. Another item that takes a time investment to assess and implement is separating users by their contextual access and not just static Active Directory groups. For example, NetScaler Smart Access and Citrix policies can be used to determine where a user is located, what device they are using, and what the security posture of that device is, and then apply relevant controls to that specific session. The last tip here is that high availability is not optional, or just a strong recommendation. Time should be taken to identify critical components in the environment and properly test failover scenarios to ensure critical business functions are still operational in case of a technology failure. For Citrix environments, this means always having NetScaler devices in an HA pair, having multiple XenDesktop delivery controllers, storefront servers, provisioning servers, as well as making sure that other non-Citrix infrastructure is highly available. That includes DNS services, DHCP, Active Directory, SQL, and hypervisor connections to SCVMM, vCenter, or XenServer. In addition, proper configurations need to be made to ensure environment availability. This means enabling things like localhost cache in newer versions of the XenDesktop, enabling offline database support and provisioning services, and a big one, making sure that anything load balanced has proper granular monitors configured. In NetScaler, this is easy to do. We have specific monitors for things like storefront and delivery controller services that not only make sure the service is up and running, but that it is returning expected data. This is one that many customers overlook, most commonly setting up simple TCP monitors that check for open ports. These can lead to complete system outages as requests are sent to services that are responding to TCP SYN requests but can't actually perform any functions.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much, Nick. So as we can see from the information that Nick just reviewed, there can be a lot to take in when looking at your Citrix environment from a security perspective. So I'll take just a couple of moments here to review how our services team could assist in these efforts, and then we'll go ahead and move into the open Q&A portion of the webinar. So how can we help? We have a professional services team made up of Citrix subject matter experts located all over the globe. Our services team works with customers to help reimagine and really transform our work styles, which is especially important when looking at it through a security lens. So around accelerating solutions, we know that getting technology solutions in place efficiently is critical to business success. And our services team can help to expedite those deployments so you can realize the benefits of the secure solution even sooner. And with an emphasis on building security into the fabric of the solutions themselves, we help to ensure that they're as safe and secure as possible. In working together, our focus is on partnering closely with customers, which gives us the ability to anticipate future needs and really drive practical innovations around that. We can also be as hands-on as needed during these types of engagements, helping navigate every step of the way, or perhaps just providing pointed assistance during certain phases of the project. And the final note here is around our services team. They really bring years of technical experience and knowledge to help augment the customer resources. Using proven methodologies, the overall goal is to ensure maximum solution performance while minimizing the organizational risk. At the same time, we're always looking for ways to enable and empower teams through education, training, and certification. So the portfolio. Our security practice currently has 4 engagements that are designed specifically around security. The first is the Digital Workspace Security Assessment, where the services team will work with you to review the Citrix environment and provide recommendations to advance the security posture of the environment itself. The second in the list there is the Network Protection Strategy. During this effort, the team will work to identify the requirements of web applications, and then using that information, we'll work with you to design and implement a security strategy that helps to mitigate the risk of network-based intrusions. Next is the Network Access Strategy, which looks at the forward proxy and policy design and configuration for the network traffic. And then finally, we have the Network Monitoring and Insight Strategy effort, which looks at the various Citrix tools available to proactively monitor and manage the environment. Here we have a hot topic, focusing in on the Digital Workspace Security Assessment. The goal of this assessment is to review typical design principles within a Citrix environment and discuss options to proactively reduce the system and network attack surfaces. During the effort, we'll work with your team not only to identify potential risks, but we'll also review mitigation options with you, prioritize those, and develop suggested work plans for how those security-focused initiatives could be addressed. The assessment itself is 1 to 2 weeks in duration, and it's quite unique in that it covers so many different aspects of the environment, from how a user authenticates to how the data and applications are secured, all the way through to the operational aspects of a secured Citrix environment. It really dives into all of the Citrix technologies as well. So a company that might use XenApp or XenDesktop to keep all data back in the data center, for example, or perhaps NetScaler for SSL offloading, Secure ICA proxy or application firewall, or XenMobile for MDM or app containerization. During the effort, our team will evaluate all of the different components and identify ways in which they can be deployed, optimized, and hardened to provide a secure environment with a great end-user experience. So no matter where in the life cycle your organization is with their Citrix environment, if you're just getting started perhaps and you haven't defined the security posture when it comes to Citrix, or you just like a subject matter expert to provide some additional insights into a pretty well-established environment, the security assessment is a fantastic place to start. And with that, we'll go ahead and move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. Just as a reminder for the audience, if you have a question for our speakers, feel free to submit that question in the Ask a Question area on your screen. Simply type in the question into the text box and then hit the Submit button.
All right, thank you very much, Katie. Okay, we do have a couple questions. So the first question we have is around pre-authentication and post-authentication. NetScaler checks were mentioned. What is the difference?
All right, that's a good question. So basically, pre-authentication checks, as the name implies, are ones that can disallow connections basically before a user is able to authenticate to the system. These are mostly allow or deny policies. Post-authentication checks are ones that are done through the NetScaler Gateway plugin. They can terminate connections during the actual session. So let's say that the user, for some reason, does not meet a requirement during that connection. We can actually drop or quarantine them on the network based on those conditions. Receiver only really supports scanning at logon. That post-authentication check is really done through NetScaler Gateway plugin. Receiver does support what's called smart access, which is the pre-authentication checks that can be tied to specific policies on the back end. So disallowing drive mappings, clipboard, that kind of thing. So it's a lot more granular than just allow or deny those connections. Of note is NetScaler now, for a little while, has had something called Smart Control, which is a little bit different than Smart Access, but it's the same idea. Basically, Smart Control lets you do this all on the NetScaler appliance. So let's say that you had many environments behind a single NetScaler high availability pair. Instead of modifying the policies on each of those, you could actually just do it in a central location on the NetScaler itself without modifying your XenDesktop XenApp environment. So that's called Smart Control.
All right, cool. Thank you, Nick. Just one other thing real quick. Florian Mazurka, who is a Senior Manager of Technical Marketing for Security, has also joined for the question and answer period. Next question we have is, how can we determine if a device is untrusted or not?
Okay. With the maybe like a BYO scenario, like externally connected devices, yeah, that could mean different things to different organizations, what's trusted, what's not. But there are some basic things that can be checked. This kind of ties back to these NetScaler scans, these endpoint analysis scans. You could have something as simple as a registry marker that we check to see if the device has a registry key that's set. Obviously, that's pretty insecure. Other simple things can be done. I think what we see mostly in the field, what we would recommend really is something like a device certificate, which the NetScaler can scan for. So not a user certificate, which would be something more like smart card authentication, but actually a device-based certificate, basically marking that device as something that was either company-owned, company-provided, and then you would, along with that, pretty much do other basic checks for like antivirus versions to control, things like ICA HDX policies on top of that trusted device check. So for that question, I will say, probably the best thing to do is implement device certificates to determine if a device is trusted or not.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Again, next question. Can I use tools like Ansible or Chef to audit for configuration drift?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is something that we're seeing a little bit more in the field here. I would say, yeah, you could certainly do that if you've got an investment in one of these config management and automation tools. Those can obviously be used for many purposes. I mostly see them for automating and deploying environments, but they do have components that can monitor and quote unquote audit configurations as well, which is certainly important. We mentioned that during the presentation there. If you don't have that, which there are a lot of customers that are not, haven't gone that automation route yet, NetScaler MAS does have a pretty simple interface to do both the automation and configuration piece for the NetScaler side. So that's all within the NetScaler MAS GUI. You don't really have to learn any coding, anything like that. But if you've already got those tools readily available, I would say, go ahead and go for it.
All right, and the last question I have in the queue is around the risk of XML without SSL. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is still a misunderstood topic a little bit. And whenever I speak to customers, I think the dangers, the risks of this are not really thought about during the deployment of an environment. A lot of customers tell me, hey, we're going to implement SSL later, or we just haven't gotten around to getting certificates yet. Everyone likes to secure the outside of the environment, so SSL to NetScaler, SSL at the exterior is always done, but inside the network, inside the company network, it's not a high priority, let's say. So for this specifically, basically, this is a scenario that happens a lot. Storefront authentication is set up as explicit, meaning users authenticate with username and password. In that case, Storefront and previously Web Interface, it pretty much works the same way, are sending the username and password to the XML service so that it can cache it and do single sign-on, all that good stuff on the back end. But as part of that, since we're not securing it, it's sent as plain text in XML formatted text. The password itself is not encrypted or hashed, as I mentioned, but just encoded, what we call CTX encoding. It's extremely weak, and I'm pretty sure you can just Google on how to break that encoding. So the risk here is that anyone that's got access to your Storefront servers or your XML servers, either one, they can do a network trace, or if they've got access to the network in between it, the networking team, they could basically just steal anyone's password inside the company that's logging on to this. So pretty risky. I don't know any cases of this actually happening, but a rogue administrator could certainly end up stealing the CEO's username and password and start doing things with those accounts or doing something else malicious. So this is one of the things that our consulting group always recommends when we come in from the security perspective. This is probably one of the number one things that can substantially decrease the risk of the internal environment, but is not very often done.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, and I would say when I was doing more projects, that was the number one thing that I saw. It was easy to deal with by using certificates, and I actually did see a case where a senior member of the management team had their password stolen, and the employee was able to get into the financial data and get the salaries of a lot of the people that work there. So it was a bad situation. That's something that can be pretty easily fixed. So I have one more question out there, and that is, how can we use Citrix to defend against ransomware?
I can take that, Mike. So
okay,
this is Florin. So I think this is where it all kind of comes together, right? So it's architecture that's been secured down, limiting ports, limiting traffic tests, all traffic, but it also looks at using a Citrix architecture to be built around, kind of purpose-built around security. So I'll give you an example. The top two applications that tend to be the target of ransomware or the vector is through the email client and the web browser. So what we're doing for a lot of our customers is, since they publish those applications so much, we put them in a kind of their own security zone. They end up being like a bastion, right? So you're moving those applications, you're virtualizing them, centralizing them, putting them on a Zen App server, and then putting them on top of something like, say, Zen Server with hypervisor introspection with Bitdefender. At that point, when the application is launched, you might click on a link, you might go to a website that's doing some sort of drive-by ransomware, or an email that has an attachment that's got ransomware built into it. Well, if you do download that application or download that attachment, then it can be blocked from running. The exploit can be blocked in memory and so forth. So what we're doing is we're taking those two highly targeted applications, moving them off the endpoint, putting them in their own bastion, their own security zone, adding additional protection. And should all the protection be circumvented, you can use something like PVS, provisioning services, to just move away from those servers, reboot those servers, and provision new instances of the email client and the web browser. So it gives you multi-layer protection against ransomware instead of just depending and having it on the endpoint. And then again, on the data side is the most important thing. You can use functionality built into like ShareFile to revert to files that are saved previously. So there's a multi-layer approach there.
Okay, thank you very much, Florin. All right, I have no more questions in the queue, so at this point I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you all who attended, and have a very nice day.